In this episode of the podcast, the noted scholar of new religions, Massimo Introvigne, helps us take a look at a group that we knew in prior decades as the Unification Church, but is now known as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, a group that recently made the headlines in connection with an individual who assassinated the former Prime Minister of Japan. Dr. Introvigne helps us understand the Korean cultural context, some of its history, recent developments, as well as the related topics of deprogramming and brainwashing. We hope you'll enjoy this episode of the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. This is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have as a returning guest, I think this is his third appearance on the program, Massimo Introvigne, who is a respected scholar of new religions. So I'll read just a little bit of his bio. You can find more information in the program notes, but Dr. Introvigne is an Italian sociologist, the managing director of the Center for Studies on New Religions in Torino, Italy, and the author of some 70 books in the fields of new religious movements and pluralism. Dr. Introvigne, welcome back.
Thank you.
Well, today we're going to be talking about, it used to be known as the Unification Church. Probably a lot of folks still know it by that name, but the current official name is the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. And this group recently came up in the news, international news, with its connection to, or mentioned in connection with the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Japan. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to provide some background and context.
Well, I believe the context is Korean Christianity. Korea is a country where Christianity had a great success, but for reasons perhaps too complicated to explain now, Christianity in Korea came to be dominated by arch-conservative evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants, whose missions were more successful than those of the more mainstream or liberal churches. And these Protestant, mostly American, fundamentalist missionaries tried to create a Christianity as disassociated as possible from any Korean ethnic or traditional element. Actually, they believed that the traditional Korean spirituality was something demonic or coming from the devil. So they tried to purge Christian congregations in Korea from all possible association with Korean traditions. And actually, in the 1950s and 1960s, tried many pastors and theologians for heresy. Well, some were liberal and progressive, but some were really accused of incorporating elements coming from traditional Korean spirituality, which was liquidated as shamanism, even if things were more complicated than that. So in one way, this takeover of Korean Protestant Christianity by very conservative Presbyterians was successful. But on the other hand, it left room for new religious movements which were born in Korea, and they incorporated elements of Christianity and elements of Korean traditional spirituality with an attention to miracles and healing and candles and exorcism and so on. So there was a flourishing in Korea of new religious movements, which became even more significant with the Korean War and displacement of many Christians from North Korea, where Pyongyang was known as the Jerusalem of Asia. It was a city where Christianity has been very successful to the south. And many of these displaced persons were in a difficult situation and found the official conservative Christianity as too cold for their needs. So what happened is in the 1960s and well started in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the Presbyterian and other conservative evangelicals had to battle a number of Korean new Christian or Christian-based new religious movements. And at first, they believed that their great enemy was a group called the Olive Tree. The Olive Tree at one stage had 2 million members. And they successfully, since the fundamentalists had good relations with Korean authoritarian regimes, they managed to have the founder of the Olive Tree put in jail, and he reacted very badly because he developed a radical theology that Jesus Christ was an impostor and only he was the real Messiah, which not surprisingly led this movement, when he came out of jail, to lose most of its members. It still exists, but it's very small, leaving room for other movements. Some of them were founded by people who had been in the huge Olive Tree. One example is Shincheonji, was very much in the news, first because of the COVID, because it was accused of having spread the COVID inadvertently or advertently. Now the Supreme Court has decided with a final decision that Shincheonji did not breach any COVID regulation, but still this stain remains in the mind of many. Anyway, Shincheonji had some 300,000 members. Other groups came from different angles. For instance, one group which is now may well be the largest Christian new religious movement in Korea is called the World Mission Society Church of God, and is based on the idea that the current leader is a woman called Zanjila, is an incarnation of God the Mother. And that's kind of common in Chinese movements, but now it comes, we discussed the Church of Almighty God, which also has a female incarnation of God, and so does the World Mission Society Church of God, which claims 2 million members worldwide, probably something less, but it's a big group, even developed a significant presence in the United States. And other groups came from the constellation of prophetic churches, which were created sometime with teachings most Christians would regard as heterodox in North Korea. And that's the case of the Unification Church of Reverend Moon. Moon is the last name, Sun Myung, which like many other pastors came from North Korea. And in North Korea, there was this mushrooming of new religious movements, which when they came to the South were very controversial because some of them had sexual rituals, meaning you pass the mantle of prophecy through a sexual initiation from one prophet, often female, to another prophet, often male. So all these groups became very controversial, and eventually the largest of the North Korean groups transplanted to South Korea became the Unification Church of Moon Sung-myung. And some of the groups which now are in the news in Korea again, have been founded by preachers who have had some experience in the Unification Church. One case is Providence, whose leader just last month went to jail or beginning of this month, went to jail for the second time for a very obscure history of sexual abuse. But the leader of Providence, President Young, was once a member of the Unification Church, even if he had experience in other groups, including the Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Now, the interesting question is, why is the Unification Church so famous? Because in Korea proper, the Unification Church is comparatively small, from 50,000 to 100,000 members, which is 1/3 of Shicheonji and probably 1/10 of the World Mission Society, Church of God. And then in Korea, there are new religions with Taoist or Buddhist, not a Christian matrix like Daesunshilyo with millions of members. So the Unification Church is a comparatively small group in the South Korean panorama. But why is it more famous? Chances are that the audience listening to us today, they may have heard of the Unification Church and Reverend Moon, but they may have never heard of the World Mission Society, Church of God, even if the latter is much bigger, or Daesunshilyo's million of members, but not very well known outside of Korea. Well, I believe there are two reasons for this. The first is that Reverend Moon, who died in 2012, during his lifetime, much more than other leaders of Korean new religions, the global view. So he tried to take his movement basically to the whole world, developing missions and also cultural, political, journalistic initiatives in Europe, in South America, and in the United States. So that makes him more well known abroad with respect of other leaders who had a larger following in Korea, but much less activity abroad. And the second one is that Reverend Moon and his collaborators, among which emerged his wife, or the latest of his wives, because he divorced 2 times, Hakyahano, still alive, they emerge for being very skilled in doing something all Asian new religions do. I mean, all Asian new religions normally have foundations active in promoting interreligious dialogue, intercultural dialogue, and what they say, world peace. Many movements, Christian and not Christians, have become very skilled in doing this. For instance, Soka Gakkai is a Buddhist movement in Japan, and it came closer to got a Nobel Prize for its activities against nuclear weapons, which after Hiroshima is something dear to the Japanese people. And other groups, including Shicheonji itself, and even smaller groups such as Taiwan's Shenjiao, or the same Daesunshilyo in Korea, they have peace organization, which attract many people because they are capable of producing decently well-organized and good quality conferences. And the Unification Church was extremely skilled in creating something called the Universal Peace Federation. And in their gatherings, they have attracted many politicians, including, for instance, Donald Trump. And I attended for the first time. Many scholars went like 30 years ago. I didn't, but after the Abe assassination crisis, I was very curious to see the reaction of the movement. So for the first time, I attended a Universal Peace Federation gathering last month in August. And here you had like Newt Gingrich, you had Mike Pompeo, you had Paula White. So you had an array of American politicians. Notice this was after the Abe assassination and the international campaign vilifying the Unification Church and its organizations. But also it's not a purely conservative gathering, because you had via Zoom people like Romano Prodi, the former president of the European Union, is a socialist, and you had even a comrade who is the leader of the Maoist Communist Party of Nepal, which happens to be the ruling party in Nepal right now. So there are politicians of different persuasion, even if clearly in the United States, since his friendship with Richard Nixon, and then the closer friendship with Bush the father, Moon and his wife developed a special relationship with the Republican Party, and they don't have such a similar warm relation with the Democrat Party. But also Reverend Moon was one of the first Asian leaders to be received by Mikhail Gorbachev, and surely one of the very few South Korean cultural leaders to be received by Kim Il-sung. And this memory remains. For instance, both at the gathering I attended of the Universal Peace Federation and in previous gatherings, there are always lavish flowers, enormous. And it comes out, these flowers are always offered by Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. So the situation is more complicated than it may seem. But there is a risk that we can be carried out by the political activities of the Unification Church and forget it's primarily a church. So the teaching of Reverend Moon was, which explains why, of course, it's controversial with Christians, is that Jesus didn't manage to complete his mission. He did a lot, and is surely a very important figure for the members of the Unification Church, but the original plan was that he should have been married and give an example of a perfect family. But because of the treason of Judas and the refusal of the milieu to accept him, Jesus could not complete his mission. So now it's needed a second Messiah to take the relay and to complete the part of the mission of Jesus, which was left unfinished, and with complicated numerological speculations, which are present in other Korean religious movements, only with different conclusions, obviously, comes out that this second Messiah is Reverend Moon himself, or perhaps was. So you need to be united to Reverend Moon and his third wife, Hakya Han, because they created the perfect family. Reverend Moon admits that he had otherwise didn't work out, but with Hakya Han it worked. So you need to be incorporated in this current of salvation, and there are different rituals for doing this, including the blessed marriages. Reverend Moon became very famous for his mass marriages, where normally he picked up through photographs who the followers were recommended to marry. They could refuse, of course, but so you will normally match an Italian with a Japanese or a Korean with an American. Surprisingly enough, many of these marriages worked out quite well. I know people after 30 years, they are still together and quite happy. Now, when I say he was, it's because when Reverend Moon died in 2012, but in fact, some years before he died, when he started having health problems, the movements went through some divisions. So on the one hand, it's important to note that a large majority of the members stayed with Reverend Moon's wife, Hakyan Moon, but the eldest surviving son and the youngest surviving son, one called Yun and one called Jung, but the name sounds very much the same. So the elder goes into under the Western name of Preston, and the younger goes into the Western name of Sean. Both they separated from the mainstream Unification Church and did their own thing. So now we have the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. That's a name already adopted by Reverend Moon before he died, which is the main body and is led by Reverend Moon's widow out of Korea. But then we have something called the Family Peace Association, which is led out of the state of Washington by Preston Moon, the eldest son, who was married the daughter of one of the main leaders during Moon's time, Reverend Kwak. And Reverend Kwak is also part of this schismatic organization. And then there is another schismatic organization called the Sanctuary Church or the Rod of Iron, headquartered in Newfoundland, Pennsylvania, not to be confused with Newfoundland in Canada. And this is often in the news because the youngest son of Reverend Moon, Sean Moon, is sort of a right-wing extremist and a great follower of Donald Trump, and often he preaches in military fatigue and the blessed weapons. Is very close to the National Association protecting the right to bear arms. And a brother who followed him, Justin Moon, who is another brother, but he has followed him rather than the mother. He inherited from Reverend Moon the weapon business. This was an important part, weapon factory of Reverend Moon's business activities. So because of you go there, I went, you see a lot of guns. It's a favorite of the journalists. But there are, of course, also theological reasons, because if you go to the gathering of the Family Federation, meaning the largest group, you see the theology insisting more and more on the messianic role, not of Reverend Moon, but of Mrs. Moon. So Mrs. Moon also has a messianic role. She has acquired some title, which curiously in part come from Catholic theology about the Virgin Mary, the Immaculate, the only begotten daughter of God. And so clearly there is an insistence on her own messianic role, which makes for the criticism by the schismatic groups that it's not the same religion as in the time of Reverend Moon, which has also economic implications, because Preston Moon in particular, he had some of the American assets, doesn't want to surrender to the church in Korea because it's a different church with a different theology, and I'm more the custodian of the original theology than my mother is. And then there are copyright issues. For instance, Mrs. Moon organization has sued the Sanctuary Church, the gun group in Pennsylvania, because it gives some sort of a bad image to the movement. And so they don't want to use certain terms which are typical of the Unification Church theology. So far they lost because these terms are hardly copyrightable. But anyway, there are three groups now, but one group, the group of Mrs. Moon, is certainly the largest, and also Preston Moon has his own peace organization, but called the Global Peace Foundation, but the Universal Peace Federation of Mrs. Moon is surely the largest and most visible and most important organization.
Oh, that is a fascinating background. I feel like I'm getting a master class on the Unification Church and the Family Federation. Thank you for setting that broader context and history. When we began, we noted that there have been allegations in the media that there was a connection between the individual who assassinated the former prime minister of Japan and the Unification Church. Can you talk about, you've discussed this in your publication, Bitter Winter, that we'll put a link in the program notes. Can you talk about that connection there?
Yeah, the connection is very simple, even if sometimes it becomes obfuscated in the media. Yamagami Tetsuya, Yamagami is the last name, who assassinated in July Shinzo Abe, or Abe Shinzo, in Nara, has never been a member of the Unification Church, but his mother is. She is to this very day. Now, 20 years ago, in 2002, the Yamagami's mother went legally bankrupt. She had to declare bankruptcy. And the son claims this happened because she gave extravagant donations she could not really afford to the Unification Church. And for this reason, he assassinated Abe. Now, what does Abe have to do with the Unification Church? He's not a member, but both he and Abe's grandfather, who was also Prime Minister of Japan, they have participated in activities of these auxiliary organizations of the Unification Church, including most recently the Universal Peace Federation. Actually, Abe has not been that prominent. I mean, he participated via Zoom during COVID to one of these meetings, and to another one, he sent a message. So, for instance, Donald Trump has been much more involved than Abe in the activities of the Universal Peace Federation, but Yamagami claimed he wanted to assassinate Mrs. Moon, but then, believe it or not, she's more protected than Abe, who is no longer in politics, and so he decided to assassinate Abe. I would say that in a way, the killer, Yamagami, has been remarkably successful because he has fueled an outrage, not so much against himself, but against the Unification Church, and in general, the excessive donations to religious organizations in Japan. So now there is a flourishing of law proposals and at least two governmental commissions to investigate the Unification Church and perhaps to broaden the investigation to other so-called cults or even to mainline Buddhist groups or temples which collects a huge donation. In Japan, this is not totally spontaneous because from many years, actually from some 25 years, there is an anti-cult association fighting the Unification Church, they call it a cult, called the National Network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Sales. And spiritual sales was a nickname coined by the media when in the 1980s, members of the Unification Church, they sold jewelry, seals, small pagodas, claiming to bring good luck for prices much higher than their values. These were private companies, but those who operated them were members of Unification Church and donated part of their profit to it. So against these practices, in the year 2000, Japan amended its law, and some of the Unification Church connected companies, and in reality many others in the business of selling religious goods, didn't really respect the law, which led to the Korean center of the Unification Church in 2007 compelling the Japanese leader to resign. And after this, they claim that the number of incidents was reduced. Now, the anti-cult lawyer claims this is not true, but statistics released by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs show that the number of incidents of so-called spiritual sales connected with the Unification Church before the Abe assassination was decreasing from 1,000 to like 20 in 2021. Now, after the Abe assassination, the government created a hotline to denounce the practice of Unification Church, and this hotline got thousands of phone calls, but admittedly didn't verify them, so we don't know. And in some cases, people were telling the stories of 20 or 30 years ago. So it is true that there has been a problem with both spiritual sales and the large donation, but this problem was becoming less important before the Abe assassination, not more important. And there is another element of background which is almost never mentioned, and this is the 30-year-old legal fight about deprogramming in Japan. You know, deprogramming was invented in United States, and particularly because in the 70s, many college students decided to drop off their colleges and join new religious movements as full-time missionaries. So when they call their parents, say, you know what, rather than becoming a doctor or a lawyer, I will sell flowers in the airports on behalf of the Hare Krishna or Unification Church. The parents were very upset. And they were not happy with the theological criticism of their pastors that would not solve their problems. So a gentleman in California, whose son had encountered the children of God, called Ted Patrick, still alive, he's very old, invented this technique of kidnapping the members of the so-called cults, detaining them in some secluded facility and bombarding them with negative information about their group until they decided to leave it. Now, in the US, deprogramming was always controversial, particularly after some deprogrammers were accused of violence or rape, and in the end, the courts of law decided it was not legal, and the same happened in Europe. So by the 21st century, deprogrammers, except for non-democratic countries such as Russia and China, where some took their trade, they could only operate in two democratic countries in the world, that is Japan and South Korea. And in South Korea, it's still going on. In Japan, it was finally declared illegal by the Supreme Court, but that was a few years ago. In the Toru Goto case. Now I have interviewed Toru Goto. That's a paradoxical case because he was kept under detention for 12 years. And when he came out, it was like somebody coming out of a Nazi camp. He was a plumb man, he was a skeleton. So he testified in many hearings, and because of the Torugotto, he was a member of Unification Church. Because of the Torugotto case, finally the Supreme Court decided that deprogramming is illegal even in Japan, even if now there is, of course, in the Abe assassination controversy, somebody say perhaps we should even revisit this decision. So this background is very important because it was not one or two or even 20 deprogramming. There were thousands of cases. It's the only in the world, Japan, where the deprogrammers also targeted the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. And most or a good part, I don't know if they're the majority of the 300 members of the National Network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Saints were the lawyers who defended the deprogrammers. So after they lost the court cases about deprogramming, they have this new angle or old angle that continues, but now becomes prominent because deprogramming is illegal, to attack the Unification Church and other groups on the angle of donations and so-called spiritual saints. Now, as I say, there may have been problems with respect to the Unification Church and even other groups of excessive donations. The Unification Church adopted a policy to give back 50% to those who complained, and that was the case of the mother of the Abe's killer, Yamagami. She never complained, but her relatives complained and got 50% back. But these problems were being solved quietly, contrary to how the anti-cultists interpret the statistics. And surely using Abe's killing, where the Unification Church is a victim, the assassin also wanted to kill their leader, to call for disbanding the Unification Church or ban it. Consider that in Japan, Aum Shinrikyo, the group responsible for the terrorist sarin gas attack, was compelled to change its name. Now it's called the Left, but was never banned. So it seems really an overkill and a sort of a vendetta, which is both a vendetta of certain lawyers, it's a political vendetta against the Abe faction, still strong in the ruling party in Japan. And now the connection which were existing, but not so strict, between this faction of the LDP, the Liberal Democrat Party, and the Unification Church are used to get rid of this faction and settle some scores within the Liberal Democrat Party. So again, I believe that there may have been some problems in the matter of excessive donations, but on the other hand, banning or liquidating the Unification Church, in this case the Family Federation, in Japan is surely something against the international principles of religious liberty, as something I certainly do not agree with.
Can you say a little bit about a concept related to deprogramming, the idea of brainwashing? As you know, the Unification Church was one of several groups that were accused of that. You have Eileen Barker's great work debunking that, and you still have folks like Steve Hassan, a former Unification Church member. Now, he does work. He presents himself as a cult expert. Can you talk about that concept and how scholars have wrestled with it? And is the Unification Church, are those allegations still made, or is that largely a problem from prior decades?
They are still made in countries like Japan and France, who has a law against manipulation by cults. And there are, in fact, proposals to bring the French law to Japan, despite the fact that enforcing it has proved very problematic in France. I have a new small book published by Cambridge University Press, Brainwashing, a couple of months ago. And basically, brainwashing is a word coined by the CIA during the Cold War. They claimed they translated it from Chinese "see now," but "see now" is more like coercive persuasion. So brainwashing really comes from the sentence, "they wash your brain clean," which is part of Orwell's novel, 1984. So Orwell was describing imaginary country model after Stalin's Soviet Union. So the war was coined by one Edward Hunter, who was a CIA agent who had cover work as a journalist, Miami Daily Herald, and was used in its, I would say, first decade of existence, almost only to describe something that the bad Chinese communists and Soviet communists did to people to convert them to communism. And then in the United Kingdom, psychiatrist called William Sargant, who was a famous psychiatrist. He was the president of the World Organization of Psychiatrists, wrote a famous book, A Battle for the Mind, where he argued that brainwashing had not been invented by the communists, but they borrow it from religion. And he didn't mean cults, he meant mainline religion. And the two examples he gave were the Jesuits and the Methodists. But he also mentioned the Salvation Army, and in the end he said that if we read as modern psychiatrists the story of the conversion of St. Paul, it's clear that Paul the Apostle didn't see Jesus or fell from a horse. He was brainwashed by the other, by the Christians. So he really, he was a kind of anti-religious man who would only save old paganism he kind of liked. But of course, his book sold well, but his theory was not very successful because of course, many people wouldn't believe that Christianity is evil. So it's another generation of psychiatrists or clinical psychologists built on the work of Sargant, and the main name was Margaret Singer in the United States, and said in reality brainwashing is not used by all religions, but only by some religions, which should be called cults. Actually, this is why we call them cults. Cults convert through brainwashing, and religion convert by inviting you to use your free will or your mind. And so the modern theory of brainwashing was built, which used some pieces of the research of people like Robert J. Lifton, coercive conversion in China, but less than people like Singer claimed, because Lifton is still alive. Again, Lifton doesn't like religion in general, cults in particular, but Lifton studied something different, which was happened in Chinese jails with the use of torture and drugs and beating people. And that's not what the Unification Church is accused of doing, or Scientology for that matter is accused of doing. So this idea was there is this sort of very effective technique of changing the mind of the people some cults use, and in fact that makes them cults. And this theory became very successful, particularly after some shocking events like the mass suicides and homicides of the People's Temple in Guyana And in Europe, the same role was played by the Order of the Solar Temple, in Japan by the terrorist attacks of Shinrikyo, because these events were difficult to understand. In Europe, in particular, the Order of the Solar Temple was a group of rich people, so you could not even explain it. These are desperate, marginal people. So brainwashing became popular, was even legislated against in France. But then, starting already from the book by Eileen Barker, 1984, about the Unification Church, the making of a Mooney, it was deconstructed mostly through statistical work, showing that out of 100 people who went to a weekend seminar of the Unification Church, so in theory were subject to brainwashing, only 2 or 3 converted, and perhaps only 1 was still a member of the Unification Church after 5 years. So the percentages are very low. And while it is true, of course, that the neo-religious movements, like the old religions, always try to develop methods to persuade people to join, there is nothing magical or irresistible in new religious movements that explain the conversion. And this mistake, I would add, has been done before, because many believe that the success of the Jehovah's Witnesses was done to their door-to-door sales technique, and they were even studied by secular companies like Avon Cosmetics. But in fact, now we know that the door-to-door of the Jehovah's Witnesses was never very effective, and now it is being almost abandoned. They do place tents in the streets because most of the people converting to the Jehovah's Witnesses and they convert because of personal relations, which is the way people normally switch religion. So door to door in the Jehovah's Witnesses was much more significant to motivate those who were already Jehovah's Witnesses. It was like a crash course, because they had to explain to largely uninterested people their religion, so they became better Jehovah's Witnesses, but they didn't have any magical technique to convert people. So that mistake, as I say, was made before. Unification Church also was never very successful in getting high numbers of converts. They had motivated converts, very dedicated people, but the numbers were never very spectacular. So all the story of brainwashing, I believe it has been debunked by scholars of new religious movement, but it's still very popular in the media because it's a quick fix. For instance, brainwashing, as I note in my Cambridge UP work, now gained a new popularity as an explanation of why Americans support Donald Trump, because for many good American liberals or Democrats, it's very difficult to understand why normal people can support Donald Trump. And so you mentioned Steve's son. Steve's son is a deprogrammed Mooney who turned deprogrammed. I know Mooney, it's a derogatory word I normally do not use, but he uses it. And then as an adult or almost an old man, he got a PhD, I believe, 2 years ago, finally. And he styles himself a cult expert, but nothing is more similar to the analysis of a cult by Steve's son than another analysis of another cult by Steve's son, because it doesn't matter whether it is Scientology or Falun Gong, he has been consulted by the Chinese, or the Unification Church, they are all the same. They use brainwashing at the service of a manipulative and exploitative leader. So there is really no effort to study the context, the theology, why one group is successful and another is not, because the brainwashing explanation is, as I say, it's a quick fix, and that's why it's successful with the media, because to understand phenomena like the Unification Church, or for that matter, why, notwithstanding the enormous persecution, Church of Almighty God, we discussed in another podcast, is successful in China, it is very complicated. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party invests a lot of money in trying to understand why they do not succeed in eradicating the Church of Almighty God or Falun Gong, but the explanation of brainwashing, of course, it's very simple. They have this technique which is magical of brainwashing. Now, deprogramming was a counter brainwashing. If you have been brainwashed, you need the same but contrary pressure to be exerted on you through deprogramming. And deprogramming didn't work in most of the cases, because thousands of people went through deprogramming and were not deprogrammed. They are still with a religious movements to this very day. In some cases, and Hassan, for instance, always uses the example of himself, deprogramming did work, but I would say it did work if people perhaps already had some doubts, or were in a way not excluding the possibility of leaving their former religious movement. But Korea and Japan are quite spectacular cases, because, for instance, in Korea, Xi Jinping has collected statements by 4,000 or 5,000 people who were deprogrammed, in some cases horribly beaten. At least in one case, the deprogrammee died, which led to great street protests in Korea in 2018. And all these people who signed statements, they are still members of Xi Jinping. So, and there are similar stories in the Unification Church. There is a story of a girl who, in Japan, who accused the deprogrammer of having raped her. It's true, when she got scared of the consequences of the trial and she withdrew her statement, but the father who had hired the deprogrammer went into a depression and ended up committing suicide. So there are many tragical stories, and I believe even some former deprogrammers now would agree with me that deprogramming was never the solution to these problems.
Well, Dr. Introvigne, this, as always, has been a fascinating conversation. You've taken a group that a lot of Christians think they know from prior decades, and helped us understand it, its context and its history, and how it's playing out in current events. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast and sharing your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, this is the podcast of Multi-Faith Matters. Look in the program notes for more information on Dr. Introvigne's work. I'll link to the books that he's mentioned in our conversation here, and at the end, I'll link to our prior conversations that we've had in the podcast. Thanks to all my viewers and listeners. Until the next episode.
Thank you.